China and the US, they cannot define the way the COP will go. Because had they been allowed to define the way the COP would go, we would have a very different result.
And why is that? After all, one is the biggest energy exporter, the second biggest emitter, and the other, the world's biggest consumer, and thereby the biggest carbon dioxide polluter. So let me get my colleague Urmi Goswami, who's just returned from the 20th edition of the COP Carnival, to get a ringside view of all the drama that unfolded in Dubai and explain the politics of climate negotiations.
Among the big players at this COP was the oil and gas lobby. You had record number of lobbyists floating around, but also you had the Arab group, which was being chaired by Saudi Arabia, which obviously was trying to protect its oil and gas industry, primarily because while it talked big on transition, it hasn't moved, unlike its neighbor, the UAE, which has made investments in clean. So recognizing that that's where the future is. Saudi Arabia recognizes this and hasn't done much about it. So I suppose having fossil fuels included was a major problem. So they had to soft pedal the language as much as they could. You had the OPEC sort of, warning that you cannot do this. So that was one set of pressure.
So when planet has been baking in the hottest year on record, different countries, their lobby groups and self-interests have been holding off the collective efforts to try and reach the global net zero emission targets by 2050.
The other set was, of course, the Alliance of Small Island States, a 39-member grouping of basically, as the name suggests, the small island states in the Pacific, in the Indian Ocean, and the Caribbean. The small island states have been pushing for 1.5 forever, literally, I'm told, since 2008, if not earlier. And they have every time tried to come back and say, cut down on, you need to reduce fossil fuels.
Let me explain this 1.5 degrees Celsius bit a bit more simply. It's basically reduce fossil fuel emissions and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Else, each of these islands stare at an existential threat of going underwater as glaciers melt and seawaters rise, or typhoons or tsunamis cause havoc to their land and the living.
Europe also called for fossil fuel phase out, except in their case it was unabated, because that they could agree on, because in the EU decisions have to be taken in consensus with 27 members.
And getting to a consensus is always a constraint. So typically they have their mini huddle before the actual COP negotiations because of their own pulls and pushes. Poland mines coal, Germany wants nuclear power, UK just rolled back its decision to ban new diesel cars after 2030, while big oil giants Shell and BP recently said sorry to their earlier pledges of capping oil and gas production and have been drilling away with impunity.
Because of their own diverse sort of pulls and pushes, they had to agree to the word unabated. But they were interested in pushing this primarily because they have to go back to their electorate. They have elections next year. Before that, they plan to put forward the communication on the targets for the next 10 years. That's up to 2040. And how do they go back and tell, ostensibly the people, nobody else is willing to move the needle. So they also needed something strong.
What about USA or the continent of Africa, where Nigeria, Algeria, Angola, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Libya are members of the oil producers cabal OPEC, but Egypt and Morocco are not.
The United States kept saying that it wanted something strong, but They're the biggest exporters, as I said, of oil and gas. So they kind of wanted things done, but wanted things done that spared oil and gas. So they were more focused on having very strong language on coal, a move that was supported by the UK. And the African group was again split between, strong emissions. Some of them wanted strong emissions sort of targets like, we need phase out of fossil fuel. The others were more focused on, okay, we're not very sure. We do need energy. We are an energy-starved country on an energy-starved continent, but we need adaptations.
And then there is BASIC, which is Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. Somewhat similar to the BRICS minus Russia, a big energy exporter.
They took certainly a slightly different view, and they said, the Paris Agreement is about reducing emissions, let's not talk sources. It was perhaps more a line that came from the Arab group, but one that the other two supported or sort of advocated either silently or loudly.
Yet, in the end, against all these odds, climate negotiators reached their first ever agreement on moving away from coal, oil and gas on the 13th of December, hailed as the UAE Consensus. Here's the controversial host of the summit, boss of oil giant Abu Dhabi National Oil Company or ADNOC, Sultan Al Jaber.
We should be proud of our historic achievement. And the United Arab Emirates, my country, is rightly proud of its role in helping you to move this forward.
While world leaders, climate activists, businesses had agreed in Glasgow in 2021 to cut some coal, and India last year had proposed widening a deal on phasing down coal to include oil and gas, Saudi Arabia and other oil and gas producers blocked it, even though the proposal won the backing from more than 80 countries. This time, it was a matter of do or die, especially for some of the bigger countries as well as the vulnerable island nations. Over to Dr. Rachel Cletus of the Union of Concerned Scientists, an advocacy group of more than 200 scientists and researchers.
It's the first time we have fossil fuels, all fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas, in an agreement coming out of these UN talks. And that's no small feat after 30 years. You would have thought we would get to the core root cause of climate change a lot earlier, but this is where we are.
That's the significance. But is this enough? Even 48 hours before the final agreement, most delegates were ready to tear off a universally hated weak draft. And the final agreement did not even have any single rep from the vulnerable islands who were naturally quite upset.
It seems that you just gavelled the decisions and the small island developing states were not in the room. Zoning in on paragraph 26 and 29 of this decision, when we really need it, is an exponential step change in our actions and support.
Even though the final text of the UAE agreement asks all countries to set ambitious emission targets over the next 2 years, some leaders have said there is still a litany of loopholes to wriggle the way out and skirt actual action. But what are they? In this episode, we will try to figure that out and much more. Like what's in it for us in India? What's the practical road ahead? And how a deal that was almost undone finally got done. It's Tuesday, December 19th. From the Economic Times, I'm your host Arijit Barman, and you're listening to the Climate Deal in Dubai on the Morning Brief. Most delegates who flew into Dubai were skeptical even before the touchdown. For starters, the choice of the host country, a large fossil fuel producer, and secondly, the host, the boss of one of the largest oil and gas company of the region, ADNOC.
I was a little sort of skeptical, as if we would get a lot out of it. You really don't know what you're going to get at the end, because while a presidency matters, it's frankly about all parties. In the UNFCCC, all decisions are taken by consensus. So actually, any one country can stand up and block consensus. I knew that UAE had a reputation to uphold, so it wasn't going to let the COP be a flop, because that's an oil and gas producer. No, the question is, how low was the bar for success?
That was Urmi. But even Rachel was circumspect.
We've seen tremendous suffering all over the world as climate impacts spiral out of control. These heat waves and wildfires and floods. And meanwhile, we know that global heat trapping emissions that are causing climate change, human-caused climate change, they are continuing to rise. We're really far off track from where we need to be to meet our climate goals. So that was a backdrop coming into this.
What made matters worse was Sultan Al Jaber's comments like this just days before the summit began.
I'm not in any way signing up to any discussion that is alarmist. I am here factual and I respect the science. And there is no science out there or no scenario out there that says that the phase out of fossil fuel is what's going to achieve 1.5. 1.5 is my North Star. And a phase down and a phase out of fossil fuel, in my view, is inevitable. It is essential, but we need to be real, serious, and pragmatic about it.
Those comments from the presidency were entirely repudiated by climate scientists all over the world. There's no question that the science is clear. We have to rapidly phase out fossil fuels if we're going to meet our climate goals. And the presidency is not in charge of.
If that did not lead to widespread public loss of confidence, what followed was even worse. First, a report by non-profit Center for Climate Reporting and BBC claiming the host country UAE was planning to use the COP28 platform to cut side deals with 15 countries, including China, Brazil, Germany, and Egypt, to sell their oil and gas. And second, a leaked letter from none other than the OPEC Secretary General urging its 13 member countries to proactively reject any text or formula that target fossil fuels rather than emissions. Enough to shell-shock everyone.
This COP presidency and this COP has been fraught with conflicts of interest from the moment that it was announced. At the same time, they have very strongly said from the beginning that they are here for the science, they're here for equity, and they got a lot of cover from the United States and the European Union nations. And I think ultimately we did see that the presidency held a space where all nations, no matter how big or small, had a voice, as they should, under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that is the important outcome. However, there's no question that having those series of stories that dropped ahead of COP and as COP was going on, it really serves to undermine and distract from the core task at hand. And in that sense was very troubling. On the other hand, what I would say is it's better to have it out in the open. You absolutely now know what you're up against. And I would say it really stiffened the spine of the presidency. And I think the final agreement, again, it's really far from perfect, but it shows a rebuttal of that line.
It wasn't easy for sure. At the 11th hour came a draft document that was so fraught that the whole negotiation was poised to fall apart. Let Urmi take us behind the scenes.
The COP presidency put out a text, which was like a crazy text. There was so much repetition in some cases. It had almost 270 odd paras, and it was weak in some places, vague in others. Like it was the text, it was like a nightmare text. So you sort of saw it and said, oh my God, if this is what they're going to this is the starting point, we are stuck here for a while longer. And of course, the UAE presidency the next day claimed that we did it to get people to come out with the red lines and negotiate. And maybe they were right, maybe they were wrong. All's well that ends well, kind of a thing. But after that text was put out in the evening, they had, of course, everybody went off to study it. Everybody is very unhappy looking at the text. There was nobody. I mean, I think you could possibly count one or two parties, if at all, who were happy. Everybody had something to be very unhappy about it. And you had around, I think, 8:39 Dubai time, you had they call the meeting of the heads of delegations and ministers. Of course, these are meetings where everybody makes speeches, not really speeches, but everybody puts out their point of view and says, this is what we're not happy with, this is a problem, this is a problem. And that kind of continued till about 4 a.m.
What followed was intense and frantic negotiations. UAE had spent millions to set the agenda for this COP and were heavily invested to prove a point that they are serious about transitioning from oil. But by then, the Saudis had already stated they were not phasing down fossil fuel, which is their economic mainstay. So in a series of closed-door meetings on Tuesday, the 12th of December, the United States, China, and leaders from the EU started hawking concessions around, along with Al Jaber.
And Tuesday was a day spent totally on bilaterals, multilaterals, regional kind of negotiations. So everybody's trying to work, how best to sort of not fix this, actually write the whole outcome document anew. And it was very clear, as I said earlier, that some language which says we are moving away from fossil fuels, or we have to move away from fossil fuels, which is not just like preambular or nice language, had to be there, or else it would be unacceptable to several parties.
From the needs of energy-hungry growing economies like Brazil, India, or some of the African nations, to the growing responsibilities of the developed countries to emit less, everybody had to find common earth. John Kerry, the climate envoy of US President, met up with his Chinese counterpart. EU leaders broke bread with the Saudis. Bloomberg reported inspiration for three key words: to transition away from fossil fuels rather than phase out or phase down, came from a recent Pacific Island Forum communique. At 8 p.m. in the evening on Tuesday, finally, there was a ray of light.
So this continued, this whole process of conversation continued literally through the night, up to 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. And one of the things that happened was clearly the text started taking shape.
Abdulaziz bin Salman, the Saudi minister, emerged as an unlikely interlocutor. He swooped into the meetings just after midnight, and after his intervention earlier in the COP, many attendees saw the prince as green energy's enemy number one. But now, here he was, trying to get a text over the line. He convinced a group of developing countries, which included heavyweights India and China, that an agreement the skeptics could accept was indeed possible.
So you were getting to a place where the text was getting frozen. And I'm told that the AOSIS had a meeting. So after it had reached some level of firmness, the text, like some more clarity, what they did was they kept meeting with the groups, specific countries, and the AOSIS met the COP president, and they said that we can't accept this kind of weak language on fossil fuel phase out.
AOSIS is an alliance representing the small island states. The oil industry had managed to bag two key objectives. Number one, there was room left for some natural gas. And number two, carbon capture got highlighted as a climate solution. It's expensive technology, but in theory, allow for continued burning of fossil fuels without emissions. The final deal also recognized targets be set in light of different national circumstances, acknowledging that poorer nations may find cutting emissions more difficult than wealthier countries.
Some people have said that, it was Europe and the small island states and the oil countries that defined this COP. Actually, I would say it's very difficult to say who defined the COP because everybody is a bit player. But yes, it is roughly the US, the Arab group, the small island states. I think the EU also played a part, but it's an alignment game.
But where the final agreement failed miserably, though, was in green finance.
It's time for nations to rise above those narrow self-interests and understand that to solve this collective action problem, we need collective funding. We need the incentives to be aligned globally.
But isn't there a funding or a financing mechanism already in place? What is lacking in that?
Well, the UNFCCC does have funding mechanisms, including the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. The reality is that richer nations, back in 2010, they said they would galvanize 100 billion per year by 2020. They have fallen short. The United Nations has fallen short repeatedly. It has made pledges that it has not fulfilled. This creates a real lack of trust in the fact that the money will be forthcoming. So there is some loose text in this current agreement that talks about the fact that developing nations need this funding, but there's no obligation on any particular party to provide it. And the IEA has said that this is going to require trillions of dollars over the next few decades if the whole world is going to make this transition to clean energy.
There is a question of parity too. Rich countries like US have had years to walk the talk and wean away from fossil fuels, but the pace of change has been frustratingly slow, even if, in many cases, some have moved away from coal because of economic reasons.
Meanwhile, you have large economies that are increasingly becoming major emitters like China and India and other parts of the world where people are still dependent on coal. And so to single out coal, first of all, is unfair because now you're going after nations at a different stage of their energy development, but also to continue to ramp up fossil fuel production in the global north and then tell developing countries that there's going to be no finance to help them make this transition more quickly. That's just unfair, and they're not going to do it. They're simply not going to do it if that's the package on the table. Now, I will say that it is in the interests of developing countries to make this transition because coal is a killer and climate impacts are seriously affecting developing countries. So it's entirely in their interest to make this transition, but they cannot do it quickly enough if there isn't money on the table. And if they don't do it quickly, the whole world is not going to meet our climate goals. So it is in the interest of richer countries as well to provide this finance. We can solve this problem if we come together collectively. If everybody retreats to their corner and makes this a zero-sum geopolitical game or some kind of, trade-related warfare, then this is just going to lead to the lowest common denominator.
The problem fundamentally is the approach.
It is a voluntary bottom-up system that has a framework at the top to hold countries together to some big collective agreements, but not individual responsibility on any particular country.
And of course, the doublespeak of the rich countries.
On one hand, the US is a very strong proponent upholding the science, talking about 1.5C, and yet is taking actions every day that are undermining those goals. And by that, I mean, this record levels of production of oil and gas in the US, which is really at odds with global climate goals. Now, we have some tremendous policies through the Inflation Reduction Act to accelerate clean energy momentum in the United States. That's going to be a big deal. It is a big deal. We have other pollution standards, methane standards. These are all very, very important. But that progress is being undermined by this oil and gas production. And the United States has never lived up to its responsibility around climate finance. It is a bit of a contradiction for the US to be calling for something stronger when it has not, as the world's richest country, has not done its part to ensure that ahead of time.
So if you ask Rachel, she will tell you, we are done pussyfooting around the problem.
I think all nations that are major producers of oil and gas should see the writing on the wall now, and they need to signal what it is that they're going to shift in their business models. How are they going to hold companies accountable for making those shifts? And they need to be hemmed in from all sides. Business as usual is the most expensive thing we can do. Climate scientists are now warning us that we are on the verge of setting off multiple tipping points, those so-called climate impacts that have huge feedback loops and multi-century impacts. Things like loss of major ice sheets that will trigger sea level rise of meters over centuries. That we can't turn back the knob on that. So the time is running out.
It indeed is. But you would also want to know, what did India get from the Dubai deal?
India, like every other country, wanted to ensure its energy security, which is the carve out that you see for oil and gas, which is as much a carve out for Saudi Arabia as it is for the United States, which is the biggest exporter of gas today. So therefore, each country comes to the table with protecting its interests. In our case, we wanted to protect our energy security. We have seen the growth in demand, energy demands in our country, and we also know that we cannot add renewables at that pace, primarily because of finance. The cost of setting up equivalent amounts of coal and setting up a coal power plant and an equivalent amount of renewable with storage is a little more than double. So therefore, we are also talking about finance and the need to address growing demand. So we wanted to ensure that there is no more onerous requirements on coal than on any other fossil fuel. It depends again how you want to see it, whether we have succeeded in keeping restrictions on coal much lower than they had planned. There were versions in which they said limiting investment, rapid phase out, and there was even an iteration where you basically had a 70% decline from 2019 levels by a certain timeline. So in that sense, we have secured our freedom or our right to rely on coal.
The next pit stop is in Baku, the capital of Azerbaijan, another old oil and gas producer, but in the interim, the task is cut out.
At least for the next 2 years, I think there is a lot that's happening. Next year is a big year. Yes, it's happening in Baku, and I think it will be interesting because Azerbaijan is actually a traditional oil and gas, a historical oil and gas producer. But here the focus will be on finance. And I think this is it. This is the most critical question. All these, whether you talk about phase out or phase down or transition away or whichever fancy way of saying it, away from fossil fuels, the only thing that matters is if you know how to do it. And the how is not just a technology how. The how is a money how. If you don't have the financial sort of mechanism or the financial underpinning to make this transition happen, then all these conversations become infructuous.
My take. Money or finance is what will accelerate change, and across forums, it is getting raised, putting pressure on the rich countries to open up their purse strings. We've seen it in the Indian G20. We will most likely see the same in the upcoming Brazilian G20 as well, much like what we've seen in the IMF meetings. The demands of climate change are indeed pushing the boundaries to say, reform the system. Now, how fast it happens, how much it happens, is a question for Baku, feels Urmi. Looking back in history, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC convention, was negotiated in the early 90s, the focus was very much on mitigation, meaning emission reduction. But since 2007, the narrative has been slowly shifting. Even earlier, in the landmark Kyoto Protocol of 1997, the Adaptation Fund took birth. Even today, the narrative is dominantly about reduction of carbon emissions from the atmosphere. But adapting greener alternatives or transitioning to cleaner technologies is also getting the spotlight. There is also a clearer recognition of the importance to reduce emissions through fossil fuels and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. That's the biggest capital the climate today can seek for. So that's it for today. This is Arijit Burman from the Economic Times, and you're listening to COP28 Climate Deal in Dubai, only on the Morning Brief. A special thank to our guests, Rachel Cletus and Urmi Goswami, for sharing their amazing insights. This episode was brought to you by sound designer Amrit Redji and producer Vinay Joshi. Executive producers Anupriya Nair, Anirban Chaudhary, and yours truly. Thank you for listening, and if you've liked the episode, do spread the word on social media. All new episode of the Morning Brief podcast drops every Tuesday, Thursdays, and Friday. It streams on Amazon Prime Music, JioSaavn, Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, and of course, ET's own audio platform, ET Play. Have a great week ahead. Till then, goodbye and good luck. All clips used in this episode belong to their respective owners. Credits mentioned in the description.